I wasn't healed in that moment, but I was one step further on a healing journey.
Yeah.
And I actually felt a sense of agency, which was really important because trauma can tend to rob you from a sense of agency. You feel like you were out of control of this thing. So now you're out of control of everything.
So good.
And what was important is God entered into that space and reminded me, hey, I've got some invitations, kind of some breadcrumbs for you that I'm going to walk you on this road to healing if you keep leaning into these triggers. So what I tell people now is don't look at triggers as the villain in your story, but it's actually an invitation from God to deeper healing.
Oh, it's so good.
You are listening to the Famous at Home podcast with Dr. Josh and Christy Straub.
Because when it's all said and done, we all want to know that we were famous at home. Welcome back to the Famous at Home podcast. Today, we are continuing our interview series here in the opening of 2024. Happy February, by the way. I think we have now entered the month of February. Yeah, I have an interview today with my dear friend, Davey Blackburn. He leads an organization called Nothing is Wasted. And I'm telling you, this ministry is phenomenal. From from a business mind, I mean, it's a ministry, but from a business mind, you think of a funnel, and they have top of the funnel, which is kind of like their podcast and that type of thing. But what they do is they connect people who are going through trauma or who are going through pain of some type into a funnel of biblical community. And they do it so well, where they pair people who have gone through a particular trauma with someone who has gone through that same trauma. And it is just a beautiful ministry. But even more than that, the reason that he's launched this ministry is through his own pain, through a traumatic situation that happened in his own life that he invites us into today on the podcast. And last week we talked with Amy Davis Abdullah about meaning in the moment, finding rituals. And one of the things she talked about is how we hold joy and grief at the same time. And so where that was a conversation on how we can spiritually give spiritual meaning to transitions in our lives, this is a conversation on how we can emotionally and spiritually enter into pain and suffering and navigate it well, both with ourselves as adults and then also with our children. And so I am so excited because there's just such a kindred spirit that we have together, that Davey and I have. Our families are very similar seasons of life, but you'll hear his story, you'll enter into his journey, and then just hear exactly how they're navigating their own blended family today after their pain that they have gone through and the ways that they lead people so well to Jesus and point people to Jesus. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to my friend and our interview with Davey Blackburn. Before we jump in with our interview with Davey, I just want to encourage you men, deadline for Leaders Heart is this week. Please make sure that you sign up for the Leaders Heart cohort this week. It's February 26 to 29 in person, goes for 6 months. If you have any questions, fill out the application. We'll be in touch with you. Would love to have you join us. Davey, welcome to the Famous at Home podcast.
Hey, Josh, it's great to be with you guys.
Absolutely. What a joy. For those of you listening, Davey and I became good friends. He actually invited Christy and I on his podcast, and it was kind of one of those situations where you just connect right away. And, since then, very cool opportunity for them to have been driving through our area and come and have dinner with us, and our families connect and meet. And so, Davey, I would love for you to share a little bit about your family, introduce your family to us, and let's jump in from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. It's one of those situations where you're like, man, why don't we live closer? It's like, these are the kind of people that you meet where you're like, there's such a kindred spirit that you want to just be neighbors next door.
And it was funny because we're hanging out and it's like, okay, is there a way? You kind of think in the back of your brain, is there a way we could figure this out? But that's the thing with Famous at Home podcast is we make sure that we invite people on that we trust and love and want to do, that are adding such value because we're all in this right together, and we're all doing these things together, but also too that there's a kindred spirit kind of in terms of just our podcast family. We see that And so I'm excited, podcast family, to introduce you to Davey and Christy and just their family here today.
Yeah. Yeah. So we live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I live there with my wife, Christy, which is another thing that seems so providential to
so cool.
run it, really be able to spend some time with you guys. But hers is spelled Kristi. And then we have 3 kids, Natalia, who currently is 10, Weston's 9, and then Cohen is 4. And we have a little miniature, long-haired miniature dachshund named Henry.
Nice.
And so it's a full house for us. We have the pleasure of leading a ministry called Nothing is Wasted Ministries. And we help people in trauma, tragedy, and major life transition, and really help them discover purpose out of their pain. And so what we tend to say, kind of our big motif or theme, is that we want to help you partner with God to take back your story no matter what you've gone through. And so we do that in a lot of different ways. Again, I said, content, we've got a lot of online content that we produce. It started with a podcast. So that's probably the main thrust of what we do. We have the podcast is called Nothing is Wasted Podcast. Josh and Christy were on that incredible episode. And that's what really got my ears perked and going, man, what is this that Famous at Home and what these guys are doing? And it was just it was actually a very convicting podcast, Josh. It was really great just to kind of hear your heart for helping families thrive at home as a precedent before anything else. And then we also do online community. So what we do that's kind of distinct is we match people all over the globe who have gone through similar or the same pain points that you've gone through. So a lot of times when you go through trauma or tragedy, you end up thinking, I'm the only one that understands, or there's nobody that understands. I'm the only one that's going through what I'm going through. And that, I believe, is a lie from the enemy. It's really one of his biggest ploys to get us isolated. And so, throughout my journey, which I'll share in a little bit, the Lord providentially brought so many people in my life that were able to speak into my life that had gone through similar things that I'd gone through. But the more that I interacted with other people as I was turning my pain around into purpose, I realized that wasn't usually the case for a lot of people. They tend to isolate themselves. So we wanted to really just offer a platform for people to be able to do that. And then we also have coaches, and those coaches are unique because the requirement is that they have gone through the exact same thing that the person they're coaching has gone through. So we have different coaches for different pain points, everywhere from, of course, widow or widower, loss of a spouse, to loss of a child, to abortion, regret, and recovery, childhood trauma, divorce, abuse, all kinds of different pain. If you've gone through it, more than likely we have a coach that is certified through our organization, but has walked that same road. So that's kind of what's unique about Nothing is Wasted. And finally, the way that we deposit all of that into the life of the church is through our course curriculum called Pain to Purpose, that churches, college campuses, now we're in correctional facilities.
Amazing.
So those organizations offer our course, and it allows someone to kind of jump onto that larger platform, so to speak, as they go through the course. So that's what we do. It keeps us extremely busy, but it's extremely fulfilling. And especially after the things that both Christy and I have walked through, now being able to turn that around to help other people in their pain.
Well, and what's so beautiful about it is your story is one that is, you've been there, you've walked through this, you continue to walk through it. Your story is one, I think, for all of us, we live in, Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so I think for all of us, you never want to minimize the meaning of someone else's pain, but you guys have, you have been through some really, you've been through some pain that many of us will never, ever have to experience in our lives. Yet there's people listening here today who are in serious pain, that are hurting, that are saying, or their kids are hurting, and they're saying, man, we just don't know where to turn anymore. And to be honest, like it is difficult. Like, we are huge proponents of therapy, finding a great therapist, but depending on the area you live in, that can also be very difficult. And so, to have support, especially from the church around you that understands and gets what it looks like to walk through pain and trauma, you guys are doing it as well as anybody out there. And that's the beautiful part. So anybody listening today, I just really want to encourage you as we jump into Davey's story and he and Christy's journey together. just really want you to hear how they're navigating their family life. Their kids are very similar ages to ours. And so that was another thing that was in common. You know, they're in it and they're doing it, and they're having to have very difficult conversations. And so I'd love for you, Davey, just to even jump in a little bit now and just share how Nothing is Wasted came to light. Why was it birthed? How was it birthed? And what's the story behind it?
Yeah. I feel like for many of us, we discover our passion or our purpose out of the difficult things that we've walked through. I mean, that's even what passion really alludes to, is this idea of suffering and what you're willing to suffer for, and what comes out of your suffering, it ultimately becomes your passion. And that's the case for us. In 2015, I was a pastor and a church planter. I had moved to Indianapolis with my wife at the time, Amanda. We were launched by a church in South Carolina, a pretty large church. We thought we'd be there for the rest of our lives at this church. I mean, we were youth pastors, just watching God do some incredible stuff. I mean, teenagers giving their lives to the Lord in droves, and we were part of just this really big movement of God that was taking place at that time. But then God started knocking on our hearts and calling us to something that felt very daunting and intimidating. Really, the call of God on anybody's life is going to feel intimidating if it really is a true calling, because it's a God thing. It's not something that you can do in your own flesh. And so we went against it for about 8 months, and then finally opened our hands up and said, Lord, we'll do whatever you want us to do, go wherever you want us to go. You just make it clear. And he did. He made it abundantly clear that we were supposed to move from South Carolina to Indianapolis to plant a church. And my late wife, Amanda, she is from Northern Indiana. I was born in Indianapolis, so it seemed like a pretty right fit or a right thing. And so we got on the ground and we started trying to build a church, and didn't have a whole lot of networks, didn't know a whole lot of people. We did what's called a parachute drop operation. So you're just spending time tilling up the soil. You almost feel like God calls you to plant a forest and drops you in the middle of a parking lot. You're like, okay, well, here we go, And but after a couple of years, we moved there November 11th, 2011. And it took a few years for us to really get kind of a core team together. But by the time the beginning of 2015 happened, we started to see some momentum. And through the course of 2015, we started seeing the church grow. And I remember in the fall of 2015, we got back from a team retreat early November, and my late wife, Amanda, she looked at me, she goes, I think this is actually going to take, like, this seems like this thing's going to happen. And I believe she said that to me on, it was probably a Sunday or a Saturday when we got back from that retreat. And that Tuesday morning, a normal Tuesday morning, for all intents and purposes, at least it started out that way. I left for the gym early in the morning. And while I was away at the gym, there were 3 men who were on a random crime spree in our city. And they broke into the home 3 doors down from us, watched me leave for the gym to break into our home. And Amanda and our 15-month-old Weston at the time were the only ones home, but she was also pregnant with our second, who was she was 13 weeks along. And she got caught up in all of that as they invaded our home. And she was shot 3 times and died from those gunshot wounds 24 hours later in the hospital. So I came home that day on November 10th, 2015 to find her. And she passed away November 11th, 2015, which was 4 years to the day that we packed a moving van up to move to Indianapolis to plant a church.
Wow. So as you tell that story, and I mean, I remember it made national headlines, and I can remember even praying for you and your family back when that happened, which was pretty wild to me that now, here we are all these years later, and just seeing the redemption, seeing you live out the redemption of that. But, there's details even in there that I don't know. You may have told me and I just forgot, but the fact that it was 4 years to the day, there's something significant about that. And I think there's something significant in terms of the way God shows up and puts his fingerprints on our story. Yep. Describe a little bit about how you saw God's fingerprints in the middle of such tragedy.
Yeah. Well, it was, I had not experienced anything, of course, near like this up to that point. We had lived a pretty relatively charmed life up to that point. I mean, of course, there was the difficulty of trying to plant the church and, people that plant with you and they exit and sometimes not in the best ways. And so some of those relational strife or that hurt, that wounding, but that was the extent of anything hard that both Amanda and I had gone through at that time. And so, but we both had very strong upbringings, incredible foundations, heritage of faith. Her dad's a pastor, my dad's a pastor, just like generations of pastors and people in ministry in our family. And so there was this, but I had this like false expectation of God that if we were in the center of God's will, doing what God had called us to do, that we could go through a lot of hard, but we would be protected from that. And it was this like unwritten agreement that I had with God that I just thought that's who God was. But when we went through this, immediately when we get to the hospital, before I even knew that there were gunshot wounds, that's the crazy thing about this. When I found her, I had no idea there were gunshot wounds. I had thought there was something horrific had gone wrong with the pregnancy. And so,
okay, that was going to be my question.
Really
what was going through your mind as you enter there? Like in terms of, did you know, what did you expect or what did you think it was?
Yeah, it sounds strange because you would think that, with the scene that was in front of me, that would be the first thing, but there was no construct for that. Like to think that somebody had broken into my home, that just didn't happen. I mean, our neighborhood was not one that would take place. And it was just so outside the realm of possibility that, and when you get into those, like what I discovered later now, trauma filled moments, your brain just goes in, it's like it goes in fast motion and slow motion all at the same time. Like everything fades in the background that's unimportant or superfluous. And it just hyper focuses in on the thing that's like survive. Right. And
shock.
So here I was I was in complete shock. I was just trying to, and so I had thought because she had gotten some dizzy spells through some of this pregnancy that she had just gotten dizzy, passed out. Like there was a ladder that had fallen down next to her that she was using for a decorative piece. I thought maybe that fell on her. That was the explanation for the blood. It was a lot of blood, but it was like, well, maybe this, so there was just zero, there was nothing that would indicate to me except for credit cards strewn out on the floor, different, things that seemed so out of place and I couldn't figure out why. But it wasn't until we got to the waiting room of the hospital, paramedics got there to the scene. They attended to her. Weston and I he was in his crib the entire time. Weston was, we get into the car and follow the paramedics to the hospital. We're in the waiting room and doctors and investigators come in and start asking me questions. And when it's like a shift happened. Like you can read the transcript of I had to do this for the trial, but you read the transcript and you go, it's like a shift happened where they realized he doesn't have a clue what just happened here. And so they broke the news to me that she had 3 gunshot wounds, 3 bullet wounds, and that they were going to try to operate because the third one was in the back of her head. And she was still, when I found her, she was still breathing, but she was unconscious. So it was very laborious breathing. And so they said, we're going to try to operate, but it doesn't look very good. And, because of our heritage of faith and because I had, again, this unwritten agreement with God, I remember Josh grabbing the doctor's hands and saying, can we pray? And I prayed the biggest, boldest prayer of faith that I could muster up. It was, God, there are people who are trusting in science and reason in this hospital. And we know that you are a miracle worker, that you are setting Amanda up for a miracle. And would you just right now, would you restore her body, completely heal her so that people will come to faith in you? There'd be a revival that sweep across the hospital. And so I had this, like, I mean, you can call it naivety, you can call it faith, you can some weird combination thereof, but I knew that she was not going to, that God was, I knew God was going to come through. But then it was 24 hours later that she was pronounced officially deceased. And you asked the question, when, how did God show up in those moments? And there was one particular moment while we were in the hospital waiting for these test results to come back where things shifted in my spirit, where it's like I knew that she was not going to make it. And the Lord did that in a very tender way. We were sitting in the hospital room. It was me and her sister, actually. I was on one side of the bed and her sister was on the other side of the bed. Incidentally, it was the same sides of the hospital bed that we were both, she and her sister, or her sister and I were sitting on when 15 months earlier, Amanda was bringing Weston into the world. And here we are now 15 months later in a very different situation, sitting on the same sides of a hospital bed. And I knew if Amanda was conscious at all that she'd want to listen to elevation worship. She used to love listening to elevation worship while she'd run or while she'd be doing some, some stuff with her business around the house. And so we put elevation worship on Pandora radio at the foot of her bed, and Pandora radio is randomized, right? You don't get to choose what song pops up. You just choose the station. But the first song that popped up was the song Nothing Is Wasted by Elevation Worship. The second song that popped up was the song Good, Good Father.
Wow.
And it was like right there in the hospital. I mean, Amber, her sister, and I, we just looked at each other, tears in our eyes. We didn't have to say anything, but we just knew that God was there, and he was telling us, guys, this is not going to turn out the way that you want it to turn out, but I promise you, I will not waste this.
Wow.
And I can't describe it any other way than it was like heaven opened up, right? It's like, and when you lose someone, your best friend, your soulmate, when you lose someone that's that close to you, there's a very thin veil between heaven and earth, it's like for a moment that opened up and God met us right there. And he continued to meet us throughout the next several weeks and months in really specific and profound ways. And so I can look back on my journey, Josh, and I can say with confidence that he's near to the brokenhearted. And I can say with confidence, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me. And that he doesn't abandon us. He doesn't forsake us, that he's there in our greatest time of need. And so, but it's only because of the very palpable ways and visceral ways that God showed up in my story and in my life during this situation.
And let's go back to Weston for a second. He was in the crib. He was 15 months old. Describe his journey or even kind of as a dad now, as a single dad, all of a sudden, just overnight, and that he's in the place while this happens. God spares his life in the middle of all of that.
Right.
Praise God. What is, what's going through your mind? What are those days and weeks after that? And even the journey up, we can get into the journey up to today, but just kind of as a dad, how you're thinking about how you're going to steward his heart. What did that look like?
Was, it was one of the most difficult things about this journey, aside from losing Amanda, was now sitting with the reality that Weston was going to grow up without his mom, that I was responsible for being mom and dad, or so I thought, in that moment. It's like that burden that I felt. And at the same time, Weston, if you see him now, he looks just like his mom. I mean, they're spitting images, and I'm grateful for that now. But at the time, grief does some really weird stuff to you. And at the time, it really made me angry.
Wow.
Because I couldn't look at him without remembering his mom and being this glaring reminder that she was not there. And yet at the same time, and this is what you learn about grief, is that you can hold two things at the same time that seem to be completely contradictory things. At the same time, he was probably one of, if not the only inspiration or driving motivation for me to get up in the mornings. Was I got to make sure he's okay. And I got to make sure that his little heart is shepherded. And I think what's difficult is, on one hand, he was 15 months old when it happened. So you would think, just kind of reasonably, you'd be like, well, he doesn't have any memories of her, as before. A lot of that has shaped even early memories. I mean, most of us, our earliest memories are 3 years old, maybe somewhere around there. Right. Yeah. So it's like, and yet at the same time, we underestimated that, now looking back on it, how much in that pivotal 0 to 3, those ages, how much, attachment is formed. And this obviously so well with what you do, but and how much in the middle of that, his primary caregiver, because she was a stay-at-home mom and she had this very steady routine for him, that all of a sudden she's ripped from him and we're just trying to survive. Yeah. And so, overnight, I'm a single dad. I'm pastoring the church that she and I had started. I'm trying to sort through my own grief and loss. And so I had wonderful family members that came around, wonderful surrogate mothers, if you will, for Weston, that came around and really helped out. But as best a situation as what you can have, it's still is extremely troubling and traumatic for a 15-month-old to lose his mom. And that trauma stores itself in the body. And we didn't kind of see it until, even a couple of years ago, just some of the manifestations of that. And so I wish at that moment, like, I don't know what I would have done differently because we're just surviving, but I wish I'd had some kind of understanding of that, like of what this could possibly do to try to, limit some of that. But again, in those moments, you're just in survival mode, trying to figure that out.
That's right. And I think God gives us, he's so gracious to give us the wherewithal and create our bodies in such a way that we can get through those moments, but then also the ability for our bodies to heal, for Weston to be able to heal and to be able to, and for you to be able to heal and grieve even years later, being able to, as we learn how the body stores trauma and how to release that trauma.
That's right.
It's profound. And, it's cool how God just, I love the book of Psalms. I think I read a Psalm, two or three Psalm every morning, because I just, there's something about David's life, the things he was under, the pressures he was under, and yet constantly just giving God glory, giving God praise through his songs, through his poetry. That there's something beautiful about that. And I think about that in relation to how all of us, for every single person who's experiencing pain, trauma in their lives, God is a refuge and strength and ever-present help in time of trouble. And he does see us through. He says, in this world you have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And so, and I don't mean to say those things to dismiss our pain by any stretch of the imagination.
No,
I think, the church can be sincere, but be sincerely wrong in saying, well, God's got this, everything's going to be fine, and kind of dismiss the pain. And I think that it's important for what you guys are doing, because you are pressing into the pain. You mentioned it. You're holding grief and joy at the same time. I'd love to for you to give us a little bit of an update here in a little bit about Weston, just even where he is today. But before we get there, I know there's probably a lot of us in the back of our brains thinking, okay, so tell us a little bit about what happened. Where is this today? Like, these criminals came into the house. They, they were on a crime spree. Where are they at today? What does that look like? What's the resolve there? And how has your grieving process interacted with finding out who these people were and the whole justice journey?
Yeah. Well, it's lots of stuff even in that question, because 2 weeks after this happened, the arrests were made. They arrested the 3 men.
This is 2 weeks.
But 2 weeks after it happened, they were able to track down. It was an incredible investigation. The lead investigator did a phenomenal job. Brought FBI, U.S. Marshal. They deployed just about every bit of resources they could to get to the bottom of this. And we were so grateful for that. We still talk to our Indianapolis police department and just how grateful we are, Detective Lynn, and how grateful we are for him. But it didn't go to trial until 7 years later.
Yeah.
And so that was a really difficult process to, and what would happen is it would start to go to trial. They'd set a date, and then for whatever reason, various reasons, it would get continued because, at one point the perpetrator wanted to go pro se and represent himself, and then he decided at the last minute he now wanted another attorney to be assigned to him. And then another point, you got COVID, this massive lockdown throughout all of the all the world, and jury trials were suspended for a while. So it's just one thing after the other. And so there's a whole lot I could say on like what God was teaching me in that. I'll say this, a couple things. One, just the grief process, and then the some of the process of the justice system, and really just sorting through, especially big things, big ideals like forgiveness. From the grief process, I didn't have any kind of sentiment toward these men until the arrests were made, because I was in shock. And I was just reeling from this devastating loss of my best friend. It was just so, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I think that's part of the grief journey for all of us. I think that's part of God's grace. I think if we felt all of it in one fell swoop, it would crush us and probably kill us. You hear people who die from, unexplainable, from broken hearts, because they the weight of that is so heavy. And so I think that God in his grace gives kind of a latency period in that. But there is always a situation, and when we teach about this, there's always a moment that it kind of turns and you go into a really deep, dark night of the soul. And it feels like this vortex of depression. And I'll never forget mine. It was December of that year. Now our house was a crime scene. So we couldn't go back into my house. I didn't think I wanted to even go back into my house ever again after that, just how that last scene was just kind of haunted me for a while.
Oh yeah.
But we're staying at some friend's house and I am physically sick, Josh. December, about a month afterwards, when it all starts to set in, I can't get off the couch at some friend. I mean, it was awful. And I'll never forget a pastor friend of mine who he lost his daughter. He's written a book on that. And he texted me and he said, he just encouraged me and reminded me to do this thing called run toward the roar. And the whole idea is to run toward the thing that scares you, not away from the thing that scares you. Wow. And so he likened that to what it looks like in grief for us, that there are things, there are triggers that are going to come up that we want to box up, suppress, numb from, try to find some kind of coping mechanism for. The truth is, the only way out of a valley is directly through it. You have to, if you're going to heal from something, you have to feel it. And I was trying to, whether it was because I was trying to put on a good, strong face for my congregation or for my son, or I was bottling all that grief up and I didn't know where to put it. And so he encouraged me to lean into those triggers and to discover, be aware of them. Okay, what is triggering me? And then instead of like running away from it, actually lean into it. So for me, what this meant, the first thing I knew was when I would get in my car, the first song that would connect with my Bluetooth on my phone was a song that was played at our wedding. So I would get so mad. I'd hit the dashboard, turn the song off or change it or whatever, because I didn't want to hear it. It was so triggering for me. So I knew the first way that I could run toward the roar was get in my car, listen to that song as long as I needed to listen to it, and just let all of that grief wash over me. And it was not pretty. It was ugly. I mean, worst ugly cry you've ever seen. But what happened, the only way I can describe this, Josh, is that waves of grief for about 40, 45 minutes, waves of grief coming over me. I mean, but then immediately it was like that knot that was in my stomach that was making me physically sick. It like started to release.
Wow.
And I can describe it as waves of grief followed by waves of grace. Mm-hmm. And I think when we lean into those triggers and we actually do what the Bible calls as lament, where we bring all of our pain to the feet of Jesus, he can handle it. He's not intimidated by it. And we actually are honest about our pain and we start to label it. We start to externalize it in a safe environment, whether it's, with a good counselor, or whether it's just directly with the Lord or a safe, trusted, close friend. Then we can begin to, start to see some of the relief of that. Now, I wasn't healed in that moment, but I was one step further on a healing journey.
Yeah.
And I actually felt a sense of agency, which was really important because trauma can tend to rob you from a sense of agency. You feel like you were out of control of this thing. So now you're out of control of everything.
So good.
And what was important is God entered into that space and reminded me, hey, I've got some invitations, kind of some breadcrumbs for you that I'm going to walk you on this road to healing if you keep leaning into these triggers. So what I tell people now is don't look at triggers as the villain in your story, but it's actually an invitation from God to deeper healing.
Oh, that's so good.
So the second thing that I knew that I had to do in this process was to go back into my house. So February of 2016, 3 months after, I went right back to my house and just kind of retraced my steps, put worship music on in my earbuds. I actually walked through the threshold of the house listening to that song, Nothing Is Wasted.
Wow.
And walked right into the spot that I found her, laid down and just wept. And the same thing happened. There was this just waves of grief, but then it resolved and there was waves of grace. And now that house, that image, that picture, it doesn't haunt me anymore because that trauma, the Lord led me in this moment where that trauma was released. And I find that that's probably the place that people get hung up the most when it comes to their grief, is they are afraid to do that kind of work to lament and really lean into the grieving process.
Ooh, you took me right in there. Like I just went in there with you in that moment. And it's like, wow, like the courage. And I think that's what it is. It takes courage, run towards the roar. And man, just, thank you for being an example to us, of how to face this, how to navigate this. And I think, one thing to think about, there's so many things to unpack there, but I think about the tears. The verse that came to my mind as you were talking about that is, that God bottles them up. And again, all those tears he has them all. Your tears are not wasted. And I think that it is an incredible illustration of the body releasing that trauma and the body releasing that pain. And there's so many times where we fight back tears, or we fight back because we don't want to feel it. We just want to suppress it or numb it. And that's where it ends up catching up to us. And so, so often the Bible just talks about that. I'm going to go back to what you said, holding grief and joy, right? It says to rejoice in suffering. With suffering comes perseverance, and perseverance, character, in Romans 5, and character, hope. And you're just like, God, really? Like the way to character is through suffering? Like, this is a really bum deal, And yet here you are. I think what gives me such hope, and one of the reasons I'm so grateful that each of you are listening to this today, is that there is hope. There's hope on either side. And Davey and his whole story and the whole ministry, Nothing is Wasted, is all about helping people walk through that and helping families walk through that. And so I'd love to, there's so many other questions. I feel like we need to do a whole other part to this, but I'd love to talk a little bit about, because I almost want to do this as a two-parter today in some respects, of like, okay, here's the trauma, here's the pain that you went through, here's how you navigated that, and here's how you encourage others to navigate that. At the same time, now all of a sudden, let's bring you up to your present day family. Would love to hear just even your journey of when you knew it was time to, meet Christy. And obviously you didn't know it was going to be Christy, but even when you, and then the blending of families and navigating now your trauma, but you're bringing another story into now your family, and how you guys are now navigating that, because a lot of listeners have that dynamic that's going on. And so we have trauma over here in this bucket, but then you have marriage, and you've got raising of kids, and you've got parenting, and those are hard enough without trauma and pain. And yet here God is, weaving beautiful stories together. And I just love to hear how you go towards the roar in your current day. But bring us up to speed a little bit. Let's go back. When did you know that you were ready as part of that grieving process? When did you know that you were ready to start pursuing a wife again? And when did you, and what did that journey look like? And then how did you meet Christy? And bring us a little bit up to speed there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I ever knew if I was ready or not. I know what the Lord impressed in my heart was not to even put my head up for a year. And so it was, I tell widowers now, especially, but, they ask, well, when did you know when you were ready? And I tell them, well, it's not dissimilar from the first time around. Like when you're not trying to fill a void of loneliness, but you were ready to love someone, as Jesus says, Paul, the Apostle Paul says, love your husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her. When you're ready to love sacrificially, then that's when you're quote unquote ready. But my approach was, Lord, I don't know how to heal myself from this. So you need to heal. Like, I'm just going to say yes to whatever you say, and I'm going to walk step by step. And I think that's where those, like, it's just a step-by-step journey, just like our journey of faith is, our journey of healing is as well. Isaiah 30 says that though he give you the bread of adversity, the water of affliction, the teacher will hide himself no more. He'll be like a voice whispering to you, this is the way, walk in it. And I think that verse really is helpful when it comes to how do we just walk in step with the Spirit, and then let him bring that next season into our life, rather than going and looking for it and pursuing it. And of course, once that happened for me, then it was time for me to pursue once he made it clear. But it was very clear for me in a very interesting and unique way. I'll save all the details up front. I had seen Christy. I met her at a CrossFit gym. She and a bunch of other folks from our CrossFit gym had started coming to our church and the church I was pastor. And so she, for several months, would come in, drop her daughter off. She was a single mom, drop her daughter off at our kids ministry. She'd engage in, she was a volunteer in our kids ministry. She would engage in worship. And it was just, you could tell there was a genuine faith about her. You can just, as a pastor, I can tell when someone's just playing church and when someone genuinely is just pursuing after the Lord. And I could tell about her. So it intrigued me. She avoided me like the plague. And so anytime I try to get around her in some way, like even in the atrium at church, like if I was just try to position myself, so like she's walking out, like she would just right turn, dart the other way. And I didn't understand it until I was one night, it was January of 2017. And I was turning in the manuscript for my book, the first manuscript to the publisher. So I was in a mode where I was asking God, what's the redemption story you're trying to write in my story? And I go to the gym that night after hours. She's coming out of the last class. And so I decided to take that opportunity to like corner her very pastorally. You know what I mean? Like just, hey, you've been going to my church for a while. What's your story? You know, like, how'd you meet Jesus? Like,
gosh.
It was super awkward. I was not being discreet at all. And I thought I was, I was way out of practice, but, she turns out in that conversation where she starts to have this conversation with me. And the long story short of that conversation is we get to this place where she says, you know, Davey, I'm really familiar with your story, but probably closer to it than what you'd feel comfortable with. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, my stepdad is one of the chaplains for the Marion County prison system. He's been assigned to the 3 guys that killed your wife. So here's this woman that for whatever reason, the only way I can describe it to Josh is that when I saw Christy, I can't describe it, but my heart, a thing that I thought was dead, I didn't think I could feel or be intrigued by anybody ever again. Cause there was had such a beautiful life and love story with Amanda. So I'm in this mode where I'm like, there's no way that can happen twice.
Yeah.
So I was like, really just in despair, going like, I think I'm just gonna have to settle. Like if I want Weston to have a mom or I'm going to have another life partner, like it's not going to be the same. I see Christy, it wakes my heart up, and I can't describe it other than that. And for 3 months, I'm so intrigued by her, and then she drops this on me that God has stitched her so closely related to my story.
Wow.
And not just related to my story, but in a way that invites me or calls me to keep running toward the roar. To wrestle with this idea of how do I feel about the gospel being shared with the 3 men that killed my wife?
Wow.
So it was all kind of wrapped up in this weird, and it hit me all in that moment where I'm like, and all I could say in that moment was, do you want to go grab some dinner? It just, and she still avoided me for a couple of months. Finally, I just kind of, I used my son to like, hey, we should figure out how to get, because Weston and Natalia had gotten to be buds in the kids ministry and whenever we were at the CrossFit gym. So finally, Christy agreed to go out on a date with me, and the rest is history. I mean, we got married at the end of 2017 and blended our family. At the end of 2019, we had one of our own. So that's our family now. And Christy's got a really incredible story. We share it on episode 100 of the Nothing is Wasted podcast. An incredible story of what she would call compounding, like little T trauma throughout, like all childhood trauma throughout her life, with her dad. And it's a incredible. I mean, she's got unbelievable resilience, but that's one of the things I was so drawn to her about is that she understood pain. And she understood doing that work to really let the Lord heal you through that. And that's still part of what so much of our conversations are about. He is using each other to heal each other, to keep, so even when we stepped into marriage, we weren't healed. But part of the sanctification process for us is that as we're weaving our family together, as we're both learning how to become one together, but then also learning how to help our kids, he's healing us in that process too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's so true. And I think that, it's funny how we talk about that in relation to parenting, that we think that the word parenting the word parenting should be becoming, because our kids become who we are. Right. And it's
Yeah.
like our own becoming is a
That's so
reflection
good.
and really a predictor in a lot of ways. That's a strong word to use from a research perspective, but it really is a predictor of how our kids turn out, is who we are as
Yeah.
adults and how we show up for them. And I think the way that we model our own pain for our kids and is really helps them gives them permission to
Yeah.
go towards the roar in their own lives. And I think so
Yeah.
often as parents, what we want to do is we want to shield and bubble wrap our children from all the pain in the world. And you guys are modeling for your children how to run towards the roar. And I think it's a beautiful example for all of us to not be afraid of it, but to but to run towards it, but to do so in the context of community. And that's what you guys do so
Yeah.
well, is you pair people with others who've been through a similar pain. And I think that so often we try to do this alone, and we already feel alone as parents, and we already are isolated in the individualistic culture we live in, which is why biblical community is so powerful and so important. And that's what you guys are doing in connecting, people, that nothing is wasted, to other people who've experienced their pain. So I'd love for you to just update us. You're now you're in the blended family. You've got 3 kids, one from Christy's previous marriage, yours, and then you've got your own together. What has that been like? Just enter us into that journey for you guys, the way you're parenting, and just even the lessons you're learning even today, right now, that you can invite us into, that maybe we can glean some wisdom.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much wisdom you're going to glean. We're learning it every single day, but I think you hit the nail on the head, Josh, when you said, parenting is just becoming. And so how do we be great parents? We be great followers of Jesus. We learn how he parents us, and then we just kind of reflect and model that, and then deflect all of that to him when it comes to, and I think you said this on our episode on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. You talked about repair. I think repair is such an important aspect of this, that we can actually go, hey, I messed up, guys. Like, we can humble ourselves as parents and say, I didn't handle that situation the best, and I'm sorry about that. I mean, even just this morning, right before we jumped on this podcast, I had I wouldn't say rebuke, that might be a strong word, but I corrected our kids about something that, as I kind of dug a little bit deeper, it was like, I was just really annoyed by it. It wasn't like a wrong or right thing. And Christy had a different perspective on it. She was like, hey, I actually think you probably shouldn't have corrected them on that. But, to go, yeah, you're right. I'm going to go back to them when they get home from school and say, hey guys, I was thinking about it, and mom and I talking about it, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't have corrected you on that. I think that you guys were doing just fine. And I think that models that idea of like, we're human, we're learning, and then they can step into that as well. And they can go, we don't have to be perfect, but we're just continuing to be in progress.
Yeah.
And so Christy and I, we come from we have very similar ideals, values, foundationally, but even that, when you layer, even with similar foundations, when you layer trauma and pain on top, and just sometimes like, guardedness because you're like, I'm afraid, self-preservation and all of that, you really do have to be very intentional about stripping some of that away so that you can create an intimacy together, as well as be able to stay on the same page when it comes to parenting. And so I think we, over the past, now we're almost 6 years that we've been married, over and go, hey, how are we approaching this situation? Not only in general, not only foundationally, but also like as our kids grow up and they're being met with new challenges and new, it's like there's new things we're trying to deal with every single day. Yeah. And it's like, okay, how do we do this? And probably the most challenging thing, and maybe some of your listeners will resonate with this, is we are, with Christy's first marriage ending in divorce, and then Weston's mom being taken in the way that she was, we are constantly running it through the lens of, is this a trauma response, or is this a normal childhood behavior? So how do we correct it? How do we address this? How do we deal with this based on one of those things? And I think that's one of the most difficult things that so we have to, because of that, surround ourselves with really wise people who understand trauma, but also understand like parenting, and just go and constantly go to them and go, hey, what do you think about the situation? What do you think about the situation? And how do we deal with this? But the Lord is faithful to put those people in your path if your eye's up for it. If you're looking for, hey, God, what should we do here?
Well, I think the word that resonates with me in everything you just mentioned was teachability. And it's not just teachability from other community and other mentors and that type of thing, but even your teachability, because I know this is hard in the moment. When your wife corrects you for how you spoke to the kids, or maybe or maybe it's your husband, flip-flop that, but your spouse corrects you on how you parented or the way that you came across to the kids. This just happened last night in our home, the way I came across to our son, and Christy's like, why are you being so hard on him? But it's one of those, you've got to be teachable to also not get to not get defensive towards your spouse, but to be teachable with your spouse so that you can have healthy conversation around what is the best for our kids. And, Christy having insight into our oldest son's, how he's perceiving the way I came across to him. And, it's different than the way that I saw it. And for me to respect her and respect that viewpoint. I mean, Christy's way more discerning and wise than I am anyway. So I'm going to try to listen to it. But
as I feel like most of our wives are,
I'm like,
probably should have listened to you a long time
ago.
Exactly.
If I would have learned this a long time ago. But sometimes it's the way and in all fairness too, I mean, and she's not here to defend herself, but there's times where it's the way she comes across too. And it's like, I just want to, and I think the teachability piece for both of us, and this is the thing that we have pursued, and I see you guys pursuing it, and it's the word that popped up to me, is that we got to remain teachable, because the more teachable we are, the more teachable our kids will become, and the healthier they'll become, because they're surrounded by parents who are willing to go, you know what, I messed up. And who are also willing to say to a mentor or to a friend, hey, I messed up. Can you help me navigate this? Which is what your journey has been filled with. From your friend texting you to run towards the roar, from the people in your lives that you surround yourself with. I think biblical community is everything.
Yeah. I think that's what you have to realize is, and there's so many people isolate themselves in journeys like this. And we always tell people, you need a team around you. And we, we make it easy. 3 C's. You need community. You need a counselor or counselors, and you need coaches. Yeah. And they're all 3 different in your life. They wear different hats. They sit in different seats.
Good.
Community is the kind of people that are, safe. You can disclose nearly everything about your life, but you don't have to be concerned that they're going to go and take that somewhere else. And it's like the people you're walking with in life, hand in hand, and you're in similar seasons of life, or you've gone through similar things, and they can understand you. And what we always say is like, but it's not for like a wallowing or commiserating in kind of thing. A lot of times community can default into that, where it's like, you never actually move forward because you're just kind of, you're just wallowing together in that. You're staying stuck on your mat. And so we say, okay, build community and surround yourself with community that can say, me too, now let's move through.
Yeah.
Me too, now let's move through. But then coaches or counselors are really important, because you got to have somebody who's objective and looking at the situation, and they're trained to be able to parse out, especially with counselors, they can look at kind of some of your childhood history and some origin and why you're seeing life the way that you're seeing life, and how to kind of recorrect or that disorientation maybe in certain ways, and reflect back God's word when you're beginning to believe lies. I think that's really important when it comes to counselors. But then you also, I think, have to have coaches, because coaches help you get a plan together and move forward. So like if I were to borrow a sports metaphor, I grew up playing sports all my life. If you get injured or hurt, and it knocks you can't play anymore, you either need PT or you need surgery. And that's what a good counselor does. But at some point you got to get back on the field. And that's when the coach comes in and goes, okay, let's put together a plan. Let's make sure that you're staying healthy. Let's kind of put checkpoints in place. And I've, the coach has been there. They've done that. They've navigated it. They know the pitfalls that you're going to be susceptible to. And so they can help stay accountable to that plan as well. And so I always tell people, you cannot do this by yourself, and to think that you are an expert at your journey is going to lead to all kinds of major pitfalls. the real successful quote unquote people in this life are people that surround themselves
Right.
with a buffering of a team. Plans fail for lack of counsel, Proverbs says, but with many advisors, they succeed. And I think one of the most humble and things that we can do, and I don't know about you, but Scripture says God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble.
Yeah.
I kind of want to be in the latter camp. Right? I don't want to be.
Yeah.
The most humble thing we can do is to admit, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I just need to buffer myself with people who can help me along this journey.
Right.
And there's safety in that.
That's exactly
There's safety in that.
Yeah. And I think that's the teachability. It goes back to teachability. I think that humility and teachability are so intricately connected. And that's what you guys model. As we close, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about what you guys are learning in a lot of our listeners are busy, full lives, have their own businesses or ministries, same as you.
Yeah.
And also raising kids in the middle of that, and how you manage being famous at home while also serving people.
Yeah. That's such a great question. You know, I thought I had it figured out when I was a pastor. We had this like kind of regular rhythm, and there was like precedents, there was best practices kind of set before me. And I was like, okay, I know how to do this. But then when we launched off and started this thing ourselves, you know, entrepreneurial journeys are, in general, you can get completely overwhelmed by it and very quickly fall prey to work, especially someone who's wired like me. I'm a high achiever, Enneagram 3, you know, so my default can be to okay, we got to get this up and going, and then use the excuse of like, this is just a season. But it's always a season,
that's
right?
right. Yep.
And I think that, truthfully, Josh, you know, our conversation on the Nothing is Wasted podcast, for me, it was very convicting, because I was in that vein of thought already. I was already thinking like, man, I'm trying to figure out, how do I manage this? How do I manage this growing, burgeoning ministry, and just trying to do this like for our family? Like, how do I help to shepherd my family and navigate all of the stuff that we're dealing with? And I was feeling pretty overwhelmed by it. And I think one of the critical things, that it was just a paradigm shift for me. I felt like the Lord just really whispered to me, said, hey, if you take care of your family, I'll take care of the ministry. And it was like, oh, okay. And what's amazing is it was almost immediate too. And I think the Lord did this as confirmation when I just kind of pulled back and said, okay, we're going to stay with some of these particular strictures that we've put around as guards for making sure that I'm not overworking. So whether you can decide that for yourself, but it's like, what keeps you in calibration? You know, for us, it's like, I'm done at 4:00. You know, certain principles or rules. I take the kids to school every morning, unless I'm traveling. You know, if I'm traveling, I'm going to try to see if I can take one of the kids or somebody with me on that. So there's intentional time. Like some of these things that we put in place, if I just go back to those principles that we've felt conviction over and not compromise on those, then God tends to put his, and it's not like a formula, right? I'm not saying that there's a 1+1, but God honors that. And I've seen that where it's like, these things happen without my having to press or strive, or, you know, it's like he opens up doors and doors that I would never be able to open up, because I think that, you know, he's honoring putting your family first, being the priest of your home first.
Yeah.
I think about Moses, right? When Jethro came to Moses, and it's the famous passage of Jethro's advice, that wasn't a leadership passage. That's a marriage passage. It's a family passage.
Good. That's good.
Because Moses is off freeing the people of Israel while his wife and his kids are back home with his father-in-law.
Yeah.
In the beginning of that passage says Jethro brings to him his wife and his kids and says, what you are doing is not good for you. And what he means by you is, yeah, you, Moses, and your family. And it's not good for the people. You're taking on the weight of everybody yourself. You've got to restructure your life so that your family is first. And then I'll take care of making sure the people are led to the promised land. And that was a huge paradigm shift for me, where it's like, man, I take care of my family. God takes care of the ministry. Now, I'm not perfect at it. I keep falling, but we try to put some really clear structures in place. We just did our team planning retreat last week. We did a calendar session. And before we went into anything as far as planning the calendar for the ministry, we had our family blackout dates. It was like, I don't care. And of course the Lord would test me on this, Josh, because twice now in our family blackout dates, there's a massive opportunity that's come up. And the 2 dates they asked me for happen to fall in. We only have like 4 blackout dates in our family calendar, right? Where it's like, this is not happening. Those 2 dates fell in those 2 of those blackout dates. And I'm having to go back to them and be like, can we find another date? But everything inside of me is like, can we just compromise? Maybe we'll figure out how I can just fly out there and do that thing real quick.
I'm in that. Like, trust me. I've been there, man. I've been there.
It's like a test where I really feel, because I've seen over the past, especially year and a half, it's like, no, my job is here. And if that means passing up an opportunity, that means we got to pass up on an opportunity, because the most important thing is that my family has me present to model the ever-present help in time of trouble that God the Father is.
So good.
And if there's anything that I learned in my grief journey, it was that God is present. And that's the most important thing to heal us, is his presence. But if I'm an absent father, I can't build that foundation for them that their heavenly Father is present. How many people have you met are trying to override this natural inclination that they have, or this disorientation that they have of God the Father, because their earthly father was not there, was negligent, was abandoned the family, abusive, whatever it was.
I'm going to use this last 10 minutes as a trailer for the Famous at Home podcast. Everything you just said was like just so spot on. It's just amazing.
That's why I love what you guys are doing, man.
I
listen to your podcast and I'm like, oh, I'm just saying everything you're saying.
It's like, oh my goodness. Like I've been met with that on so many times, where you get invited to something that you already had a family, blackout date, as you describe it. And I'm so thankful, first of all, to my wife for the way she has held boundaries. But I think the thing that I have really, because she does a better job of it than I do. We were talking about this. We just celebrated her 40th birthday, and we went away on a trip together, the 2 of us. And
happy birthday, Christy.
Yeah. And she said to send her love, by the way, to you and Christy.
Oh.
She, we're on the way back from that. And I said to her, I feel like I am, we were kind of just processing life. I said, I feel like I'm doing a much better job this day and age of being fully present where I'm at, where I'm truly, like right now, I'm with you. My mind's not going somewhere else. I'm not thinking about what's next or whatever. Like, we're truly in this interview, and I'm truly present in here, and truly present with my kids when they want to pull out. This morning we're playing magnets on the floor, building with my 3-year-old, building magnets for Marshall and Chase and Rocky, and so, but then Christy made a comment. She said that a friend recently told her that's her gift, that's her mojo, is that she's truly present. And she is remarkable at being truly present and just full on where she's at. And it's been healing and helpful for me, because I get these invitations. And the thing that I have learned in those invitations, that when I prioritize my family, those opportunities either come around again, or they come around in a different way, but in a way that you never expected them to. And I think that, again, just going back to your story, one thing that I think about are the fingerprints of God throughout your story.
Yeah.
And I think he's always present, as you said, his presence, and he's always present, and he's always guiding our story. And when we are like Moses, prioritizing what needs to be prioritized, he takes care of the rest. And so it's, I think it's so helpful. It's not easy, but I think it's so helpful that you described it the way that you did, because I know the way you described it was very practical. And I think for all of us, whether it's work or whether it's kids' sports, that's another thing.
Right.
Kids' sports. It's like, oh, wait a minute, we can't do a family vacation because our kids' sports. Well, what's more important, and what are, how, again, it's unique to every family, but we have to be honest and evaluate what activities and things are actually, how they're impacting our individual family lives and how connected we truly are. And so thank you for that, because it was practical and it was such wisdom.
Well, thank you, man. What you guys are doing is awesome. And we're huge fans.
Well, I'm huge fans of you guys, man. Again, we got to figure out a way to God's fingerprint to live closer together.
I know,
as
right?
families. the question I have for you as we close is, how can people find you? How can people get more connected to what you guys are doing?
Yeah, all of our resources are on nothingiswasted.com. And then you can track along with me on Instagram at Davey Blackburn, Davey Blackburn. I would say a couple of resources, like right out of the gate, if you guys are interested in some of the things that we have at Nothing Is Wasted. We have this, I wrote this 42-day devotional, and it's just a journey through different biblical characters for 6 weeks, 6 different biblical characters: Job, Joseph, David, Ruth, Jesus, and the early church, and how God interacts and intervenes in their pain and begins to redeem the stories. And it just kind of is an introduction into how can he do that for us as well in our pain. And so that's a great resource to pick up right there. You can find it at nothingiswasted.com.
And for those listening, the name of that devotional is?
Pain to Purpose devotional. Pain to Purpose 42-day devotional. And so, all of our resources are there. And if you want just a little teaser of that devotional, you can actually, right now, you can text to the number 66866. You can just text the letters NIW for Nothing Is Wasted to 66866. It'll give you like a 7-day teaser of that devotional if you want to just test it out. And then, but nothingiswasted.com, and then check out our podcast, the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. And that's where we do a whole lot more. We do deep dive conversations. We just celebrated 300 episodes, by the way.
That's fantastic. Gosh, congratulations. 300. Oh my goodness. I can't even believe it.
I know. I can't even believe it. So some great interviews there, lots of incredible stories. One of which, Josh and Christy are featured. I can't remember what episode number that is, but so connect with us. We'd love to connect.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we were so grateful, and that was definitely a moment that we remember very dearly, and of course, it's led to our friendship, and so grateful for that. Davey, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time to reach out to our listeners. I feel like this is a to be continued. We need to have you back.
Next time, let's do all 4 of us.
That's exactly what we need to do. Yeah.
Talk parenting.
Actually, Christy is, I'm doing a little bit more interviews by myself now, just because she's more involved. She's chosen to be a little bit more involved throughout the day, with the homeschooling and just making sure she is prioritizing that. And so actually, we just announced that a couple months ago, about 2 months ago, that she's just taking a little bit more of a step back for this particular season. And she's still doing it and still on the podcast, but I'm doing interviews. So helps give her a break.
It's so tough when those like seasons of, they ebb and flow, because my Christy's the same way right now. She by trade, she's a PA, she's functional medicine PA. So she stepped away from her practice. She could be at home a little bit long, with Cohen's going to start preschool next year. So she's like, I want to stay a little bit more here, get that quality time with him. But then, our ministry is growing so much and it's requiring more travel of us. And so we're always waffling back and forth. And we love the Straub lifestyle. We're like, maybe we should just, homeschool and just throw all of our kids in a RV and just cruise around. Maybe that's what we should do. But
I'll tell you, we lots there for sure to unpack, but that's for another time. Yeah. Every family's different. So man, we're so grateful for you, Davey. Until next week, friends, keep in mind that the greatest red carpet you will walk is through your front door.